At the end of 1986, I was at my local 7-Eleven with my friend Mike, and we were at the spinner rack of comic books. He pulled this comic book off and said, "I have this, I love it, you'll like it too, I'm going to buy this for you." It's called The Nom, it's from Marvel Comics. I didn't know what it was. Since then, you can see I've gotten several signatures on it from people that made this comic book. But anyways, while we were standing in line to get to the register, there was a man standing behind me, and he could see this comic book I was looking at, and he said, you should have this. He gave me a bracelet that he had. He said it was a POW bracelet, and if I remember correctly, it had a name and maybe a rank on there. This was a soldier that had gone missing in Vietnam. I think it was a friend of this guy's. I was 12 years old at the time. I didn't know what POW meant. I didn't know what the Nom meant. And when I got home, I showed this to my dad. I showed him the bracelet. I asked him, what is all this stuff? What does this mean? He said, the Nom, that's short for Vietnam. And it's referring to the war in Vietnam. And the POW, that's prisoner of war, and that is for American soldiers that were MIA, missing in action, or had become prisoners of war in Vietnam. And this bracelet was for somebody that still hadn't come back. Now, 1986, this is, I guess, about 13 years after our involvement in the war at that point. Well, when I found out what all this was, I said, Vietnam, the Vietnam War, that's where all of these fictional characters that I like kind of were forged, where they came from. Characters like Rambo, who at that time I only knew him from the cartoon. I didn't even know there were movies yet. I would find out later that summer. But he was a Green Beret in the Vietnam War, and people like the A-Team with Mr. T. They were all a unit in Vietnam. They were all special forces. A lot of characters from G.I. Joe, which I loved, had been in Vietnam before the Vietnam War, before they formed G.I. Joe. And this issue of the G.I. Joe comic book, issue number 26, is writer Larry Hama's favorite, and it tells the backstory of these three G.I. Joe members, Snake Eyes, Storm Shadow, and Stalker, of when they were in Vietnam together. And I've gotten a few autographs on this as well. Now, another year would pass, and in 1987, a TV show debuted called Tour of Duty. I loved this show. This was about an elite special forces unit in the Vietnam War, and I just ate this up. I was hooked. My brother loved this show. My friend down the street, who was really into military history, he's still into military history. He loved this show. This was just so great. But after the first season, I had moved away, and a lot of changes happened in my life, and I kind of lost track of the show. But I moved somewhere that had cable TV and HBO, and I was able to start catching the movies that had come out just prior to Tour of Duty, and kind of kicked off this whole renaissance of Vietnam War media. Starting with the 1986 film Platoon by Oliver Stone, starring Charlie Sheen. This was nominated for 8 and won 4 Academy Awards. This movie had a big impact. It was a big deal, and it kind of really kicked things off. I really liked this movie. It also starred Willem Dafoe and Tom Berenger. And I just watched this movie over and over again. Every time they would play it, they used to repeat. I don't know if they still do this, but they would just get a movie and they would just repeat it over and over again every day. And this was one of the ones that I couldn't stop myself from watching every viewing. And that was followed the next year by Stanley Kubrick's Full Metal Jacket. Boy, this is a great film. It's kind of like two films in one. You've got the first half where they're in boot camp. It's Marines, the Marines, and then the second half is where they're in Vietnam. It doesn't really look like Vietnam. Looks like a bombed out urban city with a couple of palm trees, but still a really cool movie. And the music that played over the end credits is Painted Black by the Rolling Stones, which would then be used a few months later as the opening theme song to Tour of Duty. Now, I watched the show first, and we discovered that we had this Rolling Stones album in my dad's album collection, so we would just play the song over and over again. But it came from Full Metal Jacket. Now between Full Metal Jacket and Tour of Duty, there were a couple of months, and another Vietnam movie came out because it was like just this explosion of Vietnam War stuff. And that movie's called Hamburger Hill. I hadn't even heard of this movie or seen it until last week. Now, this movie is based on a real event that happened. It's got Don Cheadle in it, you know, War Machine from the Marvel movies. This movie just angered and frustrated me. It's a good movie, but it's because it's a true story and you can see what actually happened during this event. Well, if you watch this movie, you'll know what I mean. You just be so angry at the decision makers who just throw people's lives away for nothing. Anyways, Hamburger Hill. And then in 1989 came this movie, Casualties of War, starring Michael J. Fox and Sean Penn. Now, I caught this on HBO in 1990. I really liked this movie. Liked it back then, like it now. It's another story about a real event that happened. And this movie is, I mean, I like it, it's great, but boy, it's so depressing. You know, these real life stories, plus a lot of documentaries I've now seen about Vietnam, where you get to listen to soldiers tell things that actually happened, that's outside of, you know, a work of art type of a film made for entertainment, and you know, okay, this is something people actually went through, and you hear and see how these things actually went. You just feel bad for everybody. You feel bad for the people living in Vietnam, the soldiers while they're there, when they come back. There's just no winners in any of this. Now, when I saw that movie, Casualties of War, it was in the year that Tour of Duty had come to an end. This was a 3-season show. I had only watched the first season in its original run, and that final episode, it was a big 2-part special, so it was a huge thing. I didn't even know it was airing. It aired the day after my 16th birthday, and it was also the day after the debut episode of In Living Color with Jim Carrey, and that is the show that myself and everyone I knew watched, and we all talked about at school the next day. So at that point, I was kind of in a completely different headspace, TV viewing space. I didn't even know Tour of Duty was still on or had come to an end, but I was able to get this giant box set of all 3 seasons about a year ago, and I finally got around to watching the entire thing over the last couple months. And you know, I it holds up for me. It was even better than I remembered. Uh, I really loved it, and when it ended, I wanted more. I wanted another season. I didn't want it to end. Had a big effect on me. But there's something weird I noticed while watching it. You get invested in the characters. You feel you start to know them, and you just subconsciously see them as maybe friends. I mean, they're the heroes of the show. You see them as the good guys, and then there are a couple scenes in every episode that are so jarring because they're like, okay, let's go on a mission, and the next quick cut scene is they're kicking a door in, and there's a couple guys standing there like smoking cigarettes or reading a map, and your hero, your friend, the good guy, whatever, he just pulls a hand pistol out and holds it to the back of a guy's head, and just blows his head apart, and then walks back out and like sets the whole place on fire, or throws a grenade in, and bodies are flying apart, and then the mission's over, and they go back and they play cards or something. You're like, it's just like, it's so jarring because you only see execution style scenes like that by bad guys and stuff, but this is what the people in the war are doing, and I don't know, it's just so jarring. Good show, but looking at it with my eyes of today, I can really see how this is it's not fun in games, but at the end of 1990, my brother enlisted in the Army, and while he was away at his 8 weeks of boot camp, he would write me letters to let me know how he was doing. Here's the first one on this big scrap piece of cardboard. Merry Christmas and Happy New Year. So that finished out the year. After boot camp, he had, I think, a week break before his next 8 weeks of training. And I went up to see him, and he gave me this cool flashlight with a bent top and all these different colored lenses you could put over it. It's just really cool stuff. Then he started his next training course, specific for the type of job he was going to go into. And he would explain it in these letters that he would send me. And, these are cool because it's on this Army stationery with these little Army cartoons at the bottom. I got another one here. Another little cool Army cartoon. And then he got assigned his job, which was in communications, transferring classified information. And he wrote his next letter to me in the form of the messages that he had to make during work there in the Army. Top secret for training, otherwise unclassified. Subject, informal letter. Kevin, how are you doing? And on the back, he wrote, send more drawings. See, I would write him back, and I would always include the drawings that I was making of superheroes and whatnot, and he would show all his friends there, and they really liked my drawings, which is cool. Here's his address at Fort Jackson, South Carolina, that I would send all the letters to. And then he sent me this giant postcard. It says, this is, what does it say here? This is Victory Tower. Here's a postcard of Victory Tower. I thought you might like to see it. This is what he trained on. And he was right. I did really like this. I thought this was so cool. I would have just loved to climb all over this. It would have been so much fun. Of course, I was... I had a lot more energy back then. I couldn't imagine getting on that now. I'd probably just be afraid of heights, but I loved all that stuff back then. In fact, I grew up surrounded by the woods, and we would dress in full camouflage and go outside and play war. It was a lot of fun. And our friend that lived at the end of the street, he had, his backyard was mostly sand, and at the back edge of it, right where the woods began, he had dug what he called was a foxhole. It was a giant hole that went over my head, maybe 4 or 5 feet around, and you'd jump inside of it, and you'd be throwing pine cones that we pretended were grenades at somebody maybe hiding in the woods behind a tree or something, and you just play war. It was a lot of fun playing war. He grew up to become a firefighter. Well, a few years later, in 1993, I rented from the video store Apocalypse Now by Francis Ford Coppola, and starring Martin Sheen, the father of Charlie Sheen, who would go on to star in the film Platoon. And this movie is really weird. It's like a strange dream. Really cool, though. I like it. Anyways, this film is so interesting. It was actually originally written by John Milius, who later went on to make Conan the Barbarian, back in the late 1960s, and it was going to be directed by George Lucas in 1971, filmed on location in Vietnam while the war was still going on. It took so long and was so hard to make this film that they actually made a film about the making of the film. It's called Hearts of Darkness. And when the movie came out, it was quickly followed by a parody film called Pork Lips Now by Ernie Facilius, who had just prior to this made the parody film Hardware Wars of Star Wars. And I think it was in my second venture into the Vault Christmas episode that I talked about the stop motion animation Rudolph-style parody films by Corky Quakenbush, and one of them was called A Pack of Gifts Now. Apocalypse Now, A Pack of Gifts Now, and that was another parody of Apocalypse Now. Film's a pretty big deal, and it would have been the very first film about the Vietnam War to come out after the war ended, but because it took so long to make, it was preceded the previous year by The Deer Hunter in 1978, starring Robert De Niro, Christopher Walken, and Meryl Streep. Now, I didn't see this film until just a couple of years ago, and even though it was nominated for 9 and won 5 Academy Awards, I actually hate this movie. I don't see the appeal. You tell me. Well, there actually is a film about the Vietnam War that precedes all of this. It came out while the war was still going on. In 1968, we got The Green Berets, starring John Wayne. I just found out about this movie maybe 2 years ago, and when I saw this cover art, I had to instantly buy it. Check out this painting. Look how cool that is. Man, well, when I got it, I watched it, and now I don't remember what I thought of it. I was going to rewatch it again for this video, but I just kind of ran out of time. So I looked it up online, and turns out it was critically hated, but made lots of money. So, I don't know. But you know what? I still think of the Green Berets as like the toughest guys in the world. I guess it's just, all those super tough guys that could live off the land, the kind of one-man army guys, all the best of the best of the best, highest training, what have you, were Green Berets. When I was growing up, they had been Green Berets in the Vietnam War. That's kind of all gone away now. It's all been replaced in modern culture with the Navy SEALs. I have come to really hate the Vietnam War and everything about it, except for a lot of the entertainment pieces that I grew up on. And I just still feel like an affection or affinity for, I don't know, the greens and camouflage and jungles and stuff about that. Maybe it's the time period I grew up or something, but I cannot get into tan clothes and deserts and caves and I don't know. Navy SEALs, in my mind, it just sounds like somebody with a lot of underwater training. How is that the Special Forces team that does all the desert missions? I don't know. I don't know anything about anything. But, I worked with a guy a number of years back that had been a tunnel rat in the Vietnam War. And he had to, because he was very small, I thought you're given the position of tunnel rat, but I find out you had to volunteer for it. But it sounds horrible because you have to crawl through the tunnels that the Viet Cong dug to go down and find them hiding underground and kill them before they can jump out and kill, Americans. But because you're in pitch black darkness underground trying to be silent and killing guys one at a time without getting detected, you have to go down and just feel your way around, and when you feel a human, you have to, he had to quickly cut their heads off before they could make any sound. You couldn't use a weapon, you couldn't use a light, and then just go from person to person and make your way out the other end of the tunnel and stuff. Anyways, suffice it to say, this guy was really just disturbed. He was messed up. He's dead now. I have another friend that I grew up with from, kindergarten on up, and after graduation, he went into the Air Force, and he had a full career, 20 years. He actually ran the space program here in Florida. He's just a tremendous guy, and he got to retire in his early 40s. He's set for life. He's just relaxing. He's like fishing every day now. He's a young man. So, like I said, I don't know anything, but it seems like military life would be really cool if you didn't have to go to war. I know, I'm an idiot. In making this episode, I found that I have a lot of internal conflict because, in a way, I think I still really love a lot of stuff about the Vietnam War, while finding that I really hate a lot of stuff about the Vietnam War. You know what, though? I really wish I hadn't lost that POW bracelet that I got all those years ago. Until next time. Whoa!